As we study the ancient past, we study the characteristics of those civilizations. We study the political, the economic, the geographic, and the social. Out of the social comes things like religion and belief and mythology. Today we're going to study mythology and understand what is a myth. A myth from mythology is a traditional story. A traditional story is a story that's been told over and over. It's a favorite among a culture. A myth usually has supernatural beings, and it's generally put together to explain something about our world, something that people want to understand. That supernatural being could be a god or a goddess or something that uses magic. Now, a myth is very similar to a legend. A legend also is a story that's a tradition. It's something that's told over and over again, but a legend usually has some type of historical basis. It's trying to describe the history of a people, maybe where their first kings came from or where their original peoples traveled from. Remember now, a myth is going to have supernatural people in it, and it's usually going to try to explain something. These definitions are muddy, honestly, because sometimes we find a myth has a supernatural person in it, but it doesn't appear to be explaining something. Or a myth has some of the characteristics of a legend because it incorporates some early histories of a people. Maybe it's a king interacting with a god. Even among experts, the basis of myths becomes debated. Once the gods and goddesses of a culture are established and those stories are told about them, then it becomes something that belongs to the culture and it can take on a life of its own. They are still myths because of where they came from. They came from stories about the supernatural that were trying to explain things. One of the most studied mythologies is that of ancient Greece. If you lived during the time of ancient Greece, you would see these stories as more than just stories. These were part of your religion. These were gods, these were goddesses that had some deep meaning to you, and they may have a more important meaning to you based on where you lived. Some gods and goddesses were particular to one city or another. You would have a special connection to some of those beings, and you would live your life based on what you learned from those mythologies. If you live in modern times, you might see these mythologies as purely false because few people still worship these gods. That leads us to our next definition of the word myth. The other definition of myth is a widely held but false belief. Often when we're not talking about mythology, we use the terms myth and truth as antonyms. They mean the opposite. One is good and true, and one is made up and false and probably a bad thing if you believe it. If it's a myth, it must not be true. It's totally false. That's a lie. That must not be a fact. It's used a lot that way. 5 myths about viruses. Myth-busting science. Myth versus reality. Common myths about cats. I want you to separate that definition as we study mythology because it confuses our understanding of what a cultural myth is. During the time of ancient Greece, these myths were part of their religion. Modern myths include religions, but also fantastic creatures like the Loch Ness Monster, Bigfoot, mermaids, even some ghost stories. Myths are part of a larger category called folklore. Folklore includes lots of categories like fables and fairy tales, folk tales, parables, riddles, poetry, proverbs. In terms of culture, myth and legend were believed to be true, or are believed to be true. Folk tales are not believed to be true. They are more like favorite stories told over and over again. Fables are also not believed to be true. They're more like a short story, but teaching a lesson about right and wrong. A fairy tale is a story that includes magic and fantastic creatures like elves or fairies. One thing about folklore is that it is a shared experience. It belongs to a people's culture in a very real, very shared sense. These stories began as oral traditions that storytellers would say aloud and they would repeat them over and over again. And if somebody heard a story they liked, they would repeat it themselves to their own audiences. And stories got passed down from generation to generation. They got passed from city to city, from culture to culture. A lot of stories from one culture got transferred to another culture and adopted and changed and modified to fit the other culture.